Good afternoon to all of you in Hong Kong. I really do wish I could be with you, but I'm there in spirit. Hong Kong is a hugely important place to me, both in personal terms, but also in terms of my development as a journalist. It's worth, I think, beginning by telling you what brought me to Hong Kong, because prior to coming as Asia correspondent to this city, I was the BBC's Southern Africa correspondent, and I'd spent the previous year, 1994, I arrived late 94 in Hong Kong, and I'd spent the previous year covering two of the most dramatic and tumultuous events of the 20th century. And they shaped hugely how I see my role as a journalist, and they shaped very much the way I think I behaved as a journalist when I came to Hong Kong as the BBC's Asia correspondent. They still shape how I see my role and the purpose of journalism. And the first was in April and May of 1994, the first democratic election in South Africa, the transition from apartheid, from that system of racial discrimination to a world in which black, white, Asian would all exist on an equal basis under one sky. It was also, of course, a time of revolution in terms of the media in South Africa, because we had gone from a situation where I would have to go illegally into the country, acting undercover, pretending to be a tourist. And so it went from that to a completely open media environment.
From prisoner to president, Nelson Mandela is elected by South Africa's new parliament.
The people of South Africa have spoken in this election. They want change, and change is what they will get.
Views being aired that would have been unthinkable just a few years before that. Black people and white people calling into talk radio in South Africa and challenging each other, challenging how they saw the world. For the BBC, of course, this was a year in which they produced the first ever 24-hour radio, news radio. Now, nowadays, you know, nearly 30 years later, when you think of talk radio, it just seems like a natural part of the landscape. But back then, 1994, this was revolutionary. And so we were able to convey the truth, the reality of the South African transition from apartheid to democracy, hour by hour, minute by minute, and it was a great privilege. We also had BBC World Television coming into its own for the first time. Now, as I say, it's something we take for granted as part of the media landscape. But back then, it was exciting for us to be able to stand in a township and broadcast live as these huge events unfolded all around us. And I was privileged to see the old flag of apartheid come down, to see the new flag of a new democracy going up, and to stand in Pretoria in May 1994 and watch Nelson Mandela being sworn in as president of a new South Africa. Now, here he was, yards away from me, swearing an oath to uphold democracy in this country, where for years, for decades, for centuries, people like him, by virtue of the colour of their skin, were told not that they were second-class citizens, but that they weren't citizens at all. And I was privileged to witness this. I was there to see the look of joy on the faces of people. It brought home to me the meaning of that word freedom. And there was something somebody said to me on the day of the elections in South Africa. He was a man called Simon Captain, who himself had been tortured by the security police. One of his children had been killed. And I said to him, "What does democracy mean to you? What does this day of voting mean to you?" And he looked at me and he said, "You know what it means?" He said, "Young man, today I became a human being once more." What a statement. It stayed with me ever since. And if you ask me at the very outset of all of this what my role as a journalist is, it is about that. It is about amplifying and deepening our humanity, about respecting it in everything I write and I broadcast. Within a few days of that transformative experience in South Africa, I had a phone call from London, from a program called Panorama on the BBC, which produces documentaries. And they said, "Look, there's trouble in a place called Rwanda. Will you go there?" I was aware vaguely that there had been massacres. Some footage of these killings had come into our offices. But I was so focused on South Africa, on the transition, that I didn't pay much attention, to be honest with you. And so I was utterly unprepared for what I found when I went into Rwanda with my team. And we did something that you don't really get a chance to do very much these days in journalism, certainly in television journalism, and that is we spent weeks without having to file reports every day, going around with our cameras, investigating, doing a very forensic job of trying to establish what the facts were. And what became quickly apparent to me was that the narrative which was being broadcast around the world of mindless tribal violence, as many people called it, as Francois Mitterrand, the president of France, described the killings there as just something that Africans do to each other, that this was an utterly false narrative. That what we were seeing, in fact, was a genocide, was a plan to exterminate an entire group of people based solely on their ethnicity. And as a journalist, it was, if South Africa was a moment of extraordinary elation for me, Rwanda was and remains an experience of the most profound sadness and indeed of trauma. Nothing could have prepared me as a journalist for arriving in this country which was empty of human beings, living human beings, but full of corpses. And wherever you went was the smell of death. And as disturbing as that was the hatred, because you knew that the people who had been killed, in very many cases, were killed by their own neighbours, people that they had gone to school with, people they'd grown up beside, people that they had worked in the fields beside, had turned on them. And now this comes to the heart of what I want to talk to you about today. Why did that happen? Why did a man who had grown up beside a family pick up an axe or a club or a spear and butcher those people? Why did that happen? Now, there were many complex reasons for the Rwandan genocide. You had a civil war. You had deep poverty, the collapse in coffee prices, for example, which helped to reduce the living standards of many tens of thousands of people. But one of the critical factors was the use and abuse of media by those forces who wanted to set populations against each other. And I was in Rwanda when you had a radio station, Radio Mille Colline, preaching hatred. This was the station which broadcasts lists of people who were to be targeted, which said, the graves are only half full, who will help us to fill them? You had a newspaper, Kangura, which preached hatred against people. And you know, when this happens again and again, and when people see that the state, not only does it not interfere to stop hate speech, but it actively encourages it, you then suddenly have the normalization of hatred, and you have the subversion of people's better instincts. And that is what happened in Rwanda. And you had out in the countryside a peasantry, impoverished, fearful of the civil war, getting a message day by day that if only they could get rid of the minority, then you would live in essentially a new paradise. Because at the root of the idea of genocide, as the Canadian academic Michael Ignatieff has pointed out, is the idea of utopia. And who doesn't want to live in a world without enemies, as he puts it? Of course, it's a fallacy. It's a toxic fallacy. Our world is diverse. It thrives on its difference. And at its best, the world that we live in becomes better because of the differences that we bring to each other, the exchanges that we make, whether it's in trade, whether it's in culture. In so many different areas, diversity is what makes us stronger as human beings. And that is critical in terms of the way I see our role as journalists. Hong Kong was my first assignment after the Rwandan genocide, and I arrived in the city in December 1994, I think still quite traumatized by my experience in Rwanda. And at first I was alienated from Hong Kong because I made the mistake of thinking this place is just about the money. That's all they care about. How wrong could I have been? Because the truth was, Hong Kong was everything that I've just been preaching to you about. It was an international city, an open city, a city that absorbed the influences of many, many places without ever losing its essential character. And of course it was a place of a free media. It had struggled against the restraints imposed before, in previous decades, under colonial rule, and had emerged with a very vibrant, rumbustious, one could say, media scene, represented by people like Jimmy Lai and Apple Daly, the cartoonist Chung, many, many others. And I learned that doing a doorstep interview, for example, with the Hong Kong press could be one of the most hair-raising experiences of your life, because these were people who asked questions with vigour, with determination, and you really had to shout. You had to use your elbows to get in there. That was the professional side of it. On a personal side, Hong Kong was a place where I believe I recovered from the trauma of Rwanda. Why was that? The positivity of the city, that vibrancy I referred to a moment ago. And of course it was the place where my son was born. Daniel Patrick Alexander Keane was born in Hong Kong in February 1996. And within a few days of his being born, I was asked to write a piece of journalism about what it was like to live in Hong Kong as a foreign correspondent and to see your child born there. And exhausted, I sat down and I wrote what is known as Letter to Daniel. And I'm going to read you an extract from that now. My dear son, it is 6 o'clock in the morning on the island of Hong Kong. You are asleep, cradled in my left arm, and I'm learning the art of one-handed typing. Your mother, more tired yet more happy than I've ever known her, is sound asleep in the room next door, and there is soft quiet in our apartment. Since you've arrived, days have melted into night and back again, and we are learning a new grammar, a long sentence whose punctuation marks are feeding and winding and nappy changing, and these occasional moments of quiet. When you're older, we'll tell you that you were born in Britain's last Asian colony in the lunar year of the pig, and that when we brought you home, the staff of our apartment block gathered to wish you well. It's a boy, so lucky, so lucky. We Chinese love boys, they told us. One man said you were the first baby to be born in the block in the year of the pig. This, he told us, was good feng shui. In other words, a positive sign for the building and everyone who lived there. Naturally, your mother and I were only too happy to believe that. We'd wanted you and waited for you, imagined you and dreamed about you. And now that you are here, no dream can do justice to you. Outside the window, below us on the harbour, the ferries are ploughing back and forth to Kowloon. Millions are already up and moving about, and the sun is slanting through the tower blocks and out onto the flat silver waters of the South China Sea. I can see the contrail of a jet over Lama Island, and somewhere out there, the last stars flickering to the other side of the world. Now that's just an extract from the Letter to Daniel. And as I said, I had misgivings when I was first asked to do that broadcast, because I wasn't sure really about the place of the personal in my journalistic work. And that view was shared by a small group of critics who used their columns and their radio reviews to attack me, and saying that absolutely not, no way should a journalist ever reflect their own personal experience. But I answered that by saying the programme for which I was reporting, the BBC's From Our Own Correspondent, one of our most long-established and most loved programmes, had as its specific mandate the idea that journalists would go behind the facts and would try to tell you something about their own personal experiences in the societies in which they lived. And I think that's an incredibly valuable thing. And so many, many people came to me with their own experiences and talked about what the letter had evoked for them. Would I do the same thing now as a journalist? You bet. Absolutely. Because the key test for me was I true to my own experience? During the letter, I haven't read these parts to you, but I urge you to go online where it's available and read it. Type in Letter to Daniel, Fergal Keane, and you can read it. Because in the letter I also talk about my experience as a journalist in conflict zones and what I saw happening to children in conflict zones. And I related that to my own experiences as a child growing up in a home which was a conflict zone. I grew up in a house which was a war zone, and that was caused by the violence related to alcoholism. And so I was true, I was genuine, and I tried to speak from the heart as well as the brain. I wrote that letter in 1996, February 1996, when Daniel was born. The following year, Hong Kong ceased to be a British colony, and I reported on the handover.
Back then, Hong Kong was a desolate or forlorn place, the most improbable of all Britain's imperial adventures, and yet it was to become the Empire's brightest prize. This was a moment he had long prepared for, and yet when the last post was sounded, Governor Chris Patten struggled to contain his feelings.
When I look back at our journalism then, I think it was definitely suffused with nostalgia, not for the British Empire, but for what we sensed was passing. And that was a period in Hong Kong's life where so many freedoms were respected. It was a period of openness and where all kinds of debates and discussions were possible. And I had a sense, as I looked out the morning after the handover, and I saw helicopters of the People's Liberation Army flying up the river. I could see that from my apartment. And I had a sense that things were going to change. And it wasn't going to be a sudden dramatic clampdown, but more the slow erosion, or the attempt to erode essential freedoms that people had enjoyed. And part of that was to do, a big part of that was to do with freedom of speech. And, you know, a big mistake is often made by thinking that all you need to do is introduce draconian legislation to get rid of freedom of speech or to attack freedom of the press. No. By far the more pernicious, and in many ways the more effective, is what you can do with people's minds. And that is to convince them that the power that they are facing is so great and potentially so malevolent that they had better learn to change what they say and how they say it, that they had better step back and reflect. It's what I call the chilling effect that takes place when journalism is confronted with immense power, and the kind of power that the Communist Party of China enjoys. And if you look, for example, at our changed media landscape, there is certainly a great deal more freedom in much of the world. Social media has ensured that. But if you look at the environment in which many of you are going to have to operate, and that is in the shadow of Beijing, in the shadow of a government which sees control of social media as essential to its greater political and social control, you really do face a massive battle in the years ahead. And it is going to take courage on your part and determination on your part. Certainly in what you broadcast, what you write, but also in the conversations that you have with yourself. Whatever you do, do not get into the business of saying that, well, it would be better, it would be more convenient if I didn't broadcast this truth, if I didn't ask these tough questions, because it's better for society. No, it is not. Freedom, people's rights to have an accountable government, to have free education, to have all of the things that currently some of you may take for granted, they depend on you asking those tough questions, on making those broadcasts which will make people in power feel uncomfortable. Don't ever get into the business of questioning whether you really should be telling the truth. No, you have one fundamental obligation as journalists, and that is to tell it as best you possibly can. I've spoken to you about your responsibility to speak truth to power, but I also want to talk about your responsibilities as people who happen to practice the craft of journalism. Because I believe you owe an immense responsibility to those whom you encounter in the course of your journalistic work. And that strikes me particularly when I operate in Africa, which is now my principal work. I'm the BBC's Africa editor. For decades, ever since the end of colonialism, that continent has suffered from a very Eurocentric or Western-centric kind of reportage. And I don't doubt that many Asians who look at how Asia is reported, many Chinese people who see how China has historically been reported, could make some of the same complaints. In other words, you get a process, often by white, middle-aged journalists, people like me, of othering. In other words, seeing you through the prism, whether you're African, whether you're Chinese, seeing you through the prism of our own background, our own cultural preconceptions, and often through stereotype. There was implanted in the Western mind an image of Africa as a place where there was only massacre, where there was only famine. The fly-speckled baby with hand outreached looking for Western help became the dominant image, and the idea that Westerners were the saviors of Africans. That became so heavily implanted. And I see a huge part of my job now as countering those kind of stereotypes, as changing, helping to change the narrative. Because I do believe as journalists there is a social and an historic obligation. Crucial to that, one of the most important things that's happened in my experience as a journalist is that I'm now challenged. I'm called to order by people who see my journalism, who read what I write. Because when I first went reporting in Africa, for example, in the mid-1980s, I could go to an African country, I could produce a television or a radio report, and there would be no comeback. Social media didn't exist at that time. Now, if I produce a television report for the BBC, it's immediately put out on social media, on Twitter, and within minutes of it being seen, people are coming back at me, challenging me, saying, I disagree with you, or saying, from my point of view, you've got that wrong. And it takes a thick skin to put up with that. But overall, do I believe, in spite of the hateful stuff that is occasionally sent in my direction, do I believe that the kind of accountability through social media is not only important, but justified? Absolutely, I do. We journalists have got to be willing to be challenged and confronted just as much as we challenge those who are in power, because we have a hugely powerful position in terms of framing the debates that go on in our world at the moment, but also the narrative, the way in which other people are seen. We have got to resist always any tendency towards othering, towards stereotyping. It's a fundamental responsibility. I'm here in the heart of the BBC's newsroom in central London. We've hundreds of journalists all around me here working on BBC's domestic news, on its world news, sports, weather, online, television, radio, reaching millions of people across the globe. Now, every time I walk in here, I'm aware of the power that we have and of the obligation to get it right. But is that very different from the feeling that I had when I walked up the stairs of the Limerick Leader and Chronicle in Limerick City in Ireland over 30 years ago when I began my career as a journalist? And back then, of course, it was a very different technological environment. You were lucky to have access to a typewriter and to a telephone, because there were usually 4 or 5 other journalists who were clambering to get hold of the same resources. But the fundamental of the job was the same, and that was trying to sift what is true from what is false, trying to spot where we were being manipulated, where there were falsehoods, distortions, where there was what is now known as fake news. It was the same then as it is now. The big difference, of course, is the amount of information coming at us. Into this building every day you have a veritable tidal wave of text, of video images, of sound, and all of that demands the most rigorous scrutiny. Why? Well, in a world with so much information and with such immediacy of information, there are many, many people, from warlords in the African bush to powerful presidents in world capitals, who have a very strong vested interest in trying to manipulate organizations like ours. And they will use all of the techniques of modern journalism, all of the technology of modern journalism, to try and get their message across, and to try, on some occasions, and distort and manipulate. And so here in the BBC we have verification units whose specific job it is to go through, particularly the video images that come through to us, It's to spot the fakery, but it's also to take footage that comes in, people send it in on mobile phones and by other means, and to spot what can be real gems of journalism. Images, pieces of sound that challenge how, for example, a particular conflict is seen. You could look at the modern media landscape with the amount of fake news that is now everywhere and become depressed. But I would counsel some optimism. Strange to hear a war correspondent saying that, but I would. Why? Because I think there's a great fight back going on, and as much as there are dangers attached to the new technologies and the kind of immediacy that we have become used to in terms of the transfer and flow of information, there are also huge opportunities. And what I want to show you next is an example of how a piece of video which appeared on social media can be taken by responsible journalists. And bear in mind that this piece of video you're about to see was initially dismissed by the government of Cameroon as nothing but fake news. It's very graphic. It's to do with the killing of 2 women and their children by government soldiers. But the BBC Africa I-team took this and, using the modern technology, challenged the notion of fake news.
This looks like the kind of dusty, anonymous track that could be anywhere in the Sahel. But the first 40 seconds of the film capture a mountain range with a distinctive profile. We spent hours trying to match this range to the topography of northern Cameroon. And then, in late July, we received a tip-off from a Cameroonian source. Have you looked at the area near Zelevet? Close to the town of Zelevet, we found a match for the ridgeline. It places the scene on a dirt road just outside a village called Krawamafa. A few hundred meters away is the border with Nigeria. The video also reveals other details that can be matched precisely to what we see on the satellite imagery. This track, these buildings, and these trees. Putting all this evidence together, we can say with certainty that the killings took place here.
I've come outside now, and this is the statue of George Orwell in front of BBC headquarters. And George Orwell, of course, the author of books like 1984, Animal Farm, great classics of English literature. And also, of course, a wonderful essayist and theorist on the role of journalism, particularly in societies which are under siege from totalitarian thought. Orwell famously said, and it's written here, inscribed in the stone beside his statue, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not wish to hear. And that's certainly true if you're challenging the Communist Party of China, if you're challenging Donald Trump, if you're challenging Vladimir Putin. But it's also important that you challenge yourself. Far too often nowadays I encounter people coming into journalism who believe all that matters is that they have an opinion, a strongly held opinion on a particular issue. No. What matters is that you rigorously investigate your own opinions, is that you take what you believe and you subject it to forensic examination, because your opinion only really matters when you've taken it out, taken it apart, when you've critically tried to see things from the point of view of the other person. That's why I believe empathy is hugely important in journalism, and I've spoken about that, the value of empathy. But trust me, when you go out there into the media marketplace, you're going to be assaulted by all of the things that I've spoken about, the fake news, the manipulation, the distortion, the people who want to be your friends so that you will convey their particular point of view. It's a great seductive offer, the idea that people in power will bring you in, will make you feel that they're giving you secrets, that in some sense you're part of the power structure, of the power establishment. You never are, you never can be. It's not your job. From where I stand now, I see certainly a media landscape that is full of pitfalls, full of dangers. But I'm also fundamentally an optimist, and that may seem a strange thing for a man who spent so much of his life in conflict zones, watching the worst of what people can do to each other, watching the relentless lying, scheming, manipulating of governments and of people in power, and not all of them dictatorships. In spite of all of that, I remain an optimist because of the human decency that I see whenever I travel to an African conflict zone, whenever I come to your part of the world and just interact with people on a day-to-day basis. I really do fundamentally believe in the goodness of humanity. That's the message I've taken away from all these years as a journalist. And your role as journalists is to uphold that goodness, is to deepen our decency, our sense of connection across the world, across cultures. Thank you.